When Donald Trump launched a wave of tariffs targeting Canada, the move was supposed to intimidate, a blunt show of economic muscle meant to force Canadian concessions. But instead, it triggered something unexpected. Ford and other American automakers found themselves tangled in the very web they helped build as deeply intertwined supply chains snapped under pressure. Over half the parts in Canadian assembled vehicles come from the US, and vice versa. If this opened your eyes, don't just scroll past like this to push the truth into more feeds. Comment your perspective. Your voice is part of the story. Share this with someone who still believes the old myths. Subscribe for more straight talk on power, politics, and the shifts shaping our world. Because silence keeps the cycle going. Awareness breaks it, and together we decide what comes next. Making tariffs less a tool of leverage and more a boomerang. Layoffs hit U.S. factories, prices surged, and in the chaos, Canada didn't fold, it recalibrated. Canada's response wasn't loud, but it was decisive. Faced with economic coercion, it pivoted, cutting domestic red tape, investing $2 billion into industrial resilience, and signing trade agreements with Europe and Asia. The crisis exposed vulnerabilities, but it also lit a fire under strategic innovation, from critical minerals to clean tech. What began as a confrontation reshaped Canada's economic identity, not through retaliation, but through reinvention. It started like any other Trump-era tantrum, this time tariffs aimed squarely at Canada. The goal? Economic submission. The method? A barrage of protectionist measures, with U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs as the spearhead, followed by a steady drumbeat of threats and pressure. Washington, under the illusion of dominance, thought Canada would fold. They thought economic coercion would be enough. They were wrong, because that trade war didn't weaken Canada, it transformed it. Trump's administration fundamentally misread the situation. What they didn't account for was the depth of economic interdependence between the US and Canada, especially in the auto industry. It wasn't just about trade numbers, it was about deeply embedded supply chains. Nearly 50% of the parts in a Canadian assembled vehicle come from the United States, and the same is true in reverse. You disrupt that system, and you're not just hurting Canada, you're wounding Detroit, Ohio, Kentucky. You're punching yourself in the face, and punch they did. Ford, General Motors, and other U.S. manufacturers began to feel the sting. With tariffs in place, costs soared. Steel got more expensive. Aluminum followed. Auto parts became harder to source. Layoffs loomed. And soon, even Trump's most loyal industrial base began to see the cracks. The narrative of America first was now costing American jobs. Meanwhile, Canada didn't panic. It pivoted. Faced with economic aggression, Canada launched a counteroffensive built not on retaliation, but on diversification. New trade deals with the European Union, strategic partnerships with Asia, a landmark agreement with Indonesia. Canada wasn't just playing defense, it was building a new game plan, one that didn't rely on American goodwill or volatility. It didn't stop at trade. Ottawa rolled out domestic reforms. They streamlined project approvals, cut taxes, launched a $2 billion support fund for affected industries and workers. Investments poured into critical sectors, clean energy, advanced technology, and, crucially, critical minerals. The very resources the world was about to fight over. Canada was stockpiling and developing. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated, measured, strategic. And while Trump was busy tweeting threats, Canada was rebuilding its economic future on its own terms. North America's supply chain wasn't a weapon, it was a fragile lifeline, and the U.S. cut it without realizing it was holding both ends. In the process, American home builders faced higher lumber costs. U.S. consumers saw vehicle prices rise. Tariffs on Canadian imports backfired, pushing inflation in the U.S. higher just as the economy was struggling to find footing. Canada didn't just survive, it adapted and came out stronger. What followed was a national reckoning. Canadians began to see the value of sovereignty, not as a talking point, but as a strategy. Dependence on a single market, even a neighbor, had become a liability. Domestic pride surged, not in a nationalistic sense, but as a form of resilience. Support for local industry grew. Confidence in Canada's own capabilities soared. That pride became policy. Ottawa reimagined economic sovereignty, not through isolationism, but through strategic independence. This wasn't about slamming the door on America. It was about making sure that if America slammed it first, Canada wouldn't be left in the cold. And that's exactly what happened. Canada deepened its ties with Mexico, forming a more unified North American front. While the U.S. was playing economic whack-a-mole, Canada and Mexico were signing new agreements that rerouted supply chains and created alternatives to U.S. dominance. The result? Less leverage for Washington and more stability for everyone else. The global pivot was underway. Canada's outreach to Europe and Asia wasn't just symbolic. These were real trade routes, real contracts, real shipments of goods bypassing traditional U.S. entry points. The economic map of North America was being redrawn in real time, and the U.S. was standing still. All of this exposed the hollowness of Trump's economic coercion strategy. Tariffs didn't break Canada. They didn't bring jobs home. They sparked inflation, confusion, and disruption. And they proved that in a global economy, aggression isn't power, it's vulnerability. Economist Richard Wolff called it clearly. Protectionism without a plan is just sabotage. The U.S. sabotaged its own manufacturing base, its own consumers, its own alliances. And Canada? Canada turned crisis into strategy. Through every twist in this trade war, one thing became clear. Resilience isn't just about surviving pressure. It's about building alternatives before the pressure arrives. Canada did that. It diversified its economy. It broadened its markets. It invested in innovation. And it emerged with a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about beating Trump's tariffs. This was about building an economy that doesn't flinch every time Washington has a political meltdown. And that lesson matters more than ever. Diversification isn't just a talking point, it's economic armor. Canada's decision to move into global markets rather than double down on dependence meant that when the U.S. stumbled, Canada didn't fall with it. That kind of stability is what builds real sovereignty, not slogans, not threats, strategy. What this trade war revealed is something far more profound than a fight over car parts or steel. It revealed that the world has changed. The days of economic bullying are over. Countries don't have to choose between submission or collapse. There's a third way: resilience through diversification, alliances, and independence. Canada found that path, and it's not going back. The irony is brutal. The U.S., in trying to corner its neighbor, pushed Canada toward a stronger, more globally connected economy. Washington's loss wasn't just political, it was strategic, and it has reshaped how Canada and the world thinks about sovereignty in a global age. In the end, it wasn't the tariffs that changed Canada. It was the response, the calm, calculated rejection of coercion, the bet on cooperation over capitulation, the investment in long-term strategy instead of reactionary panic. This is the story of a country that refused to be bullied and came out stronger for it. If you want more breakdowns like this, backed by facts, focused on truth, and cutting through the political noise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More is coming. The United States thought it could flex, impose tariffs, and bring Canada to heel. It didn't expect Canada to bite back with strategy, with grit, and with a plan to leave economic dependence behind. And the backlash wasn't just political, it hit the heart of the U.S. economy, the auto industry. The myth of American self-reliance cracked the moment Detroit realized it couldn't build a car without Canada. Not one. The supply chains that keep vehicles rolling off the line weren't national. They were continental. And every time Trump's administration pulled a protectionist stunt, it threw a wrench into those gears. Costs shot up. Jobs were put on the line. And the very workers Trump claimed to protect, they were the ones staring down layoffs. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, Canada didn't play the victim. It took the blow and recalibrated. The government fast-tracked tax cuts to help industries hit by U.S. tariffs. They slashed red tape on industrial projects and set up a $2 billion war chest to shield workers and businesses from the shock. They didn't just put a bandage on the wound, they rebuilt the whole arm. That $2 billion wasn't wasted. It went into modernizing Canadian industry, investing in advanced tech, and accelerating the clean energy transition. Canada started to move ahead while the U.S. kept looking backward. And here's the kicker. While Trump was posturing, Canada was negotiating. New trade deals with Europe opened up access to 500 million consumers. Partnerships with Asia, including Indonesia, gave Canadian businesses entirely new markets. No more being tethered to the whims of an unpredictable neighbor. The economic center of gravity started to shift. Canada was no longer just America's polite junior partner. It was building an identity rooted in innovation, diversification, and sovereignty. That wasn't just economic, it was personal. This trade war sparked something deeper, a national awakening. Canadians began asking why their economy was so vulnerable to one country's tantrums. Why should a president's bad day in Washington mean layoffs in Windsor or price spikes in Regina? That resentment turned into pride. Pride in doing things differently, pride in standing up, not just for industry, but for independence. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Because when push came to shove, Canada shoved back, with policy, with purpose, and with the will to chart its own course. And just as the U.S. tried to corner Canada, something else happened. Mexico stepped in. Ottawa and Mexico City began to work more closely, leveraging their mutual interests to counterbalance the United States' erratic trade moves. Through joint agreements and regional coordination, they created a united front, one that made it harder for Washington to divide and conquer. And guess what? It worked. By tightening ties with Mexico, Canada not only diversified its supply chains, but also strengthened its negotiating position. Washington suddenly found itself outmaneuvered, surrounded by partners who no longer needed to play by its rules. The old North American power dynamic shifted, and Canada had helped lead that charge. Even the sectors most bruised by U.S. aggression found footing. Steel, Canada doubled down on production, opened new export channels, and built strategic reserves. Lumber, Ottawa worked with provinces to cushion the blow of U.S. duties while simultaneously securing new buyers overseas. Autos, Canada began to invest in electric vehicle production, battery technology, and, crucially, the minerals that make all of it possible. That last piece is key. While the U.S. fumbled and failed to secure critical mineral supply chains, Canada sprinted ahead. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper. The raw materials that will define the 21st century economy, Canada holds them, and it's not waiting for American approval to put them to use. This isn't just resilience, it's foresight, because Canada knows that real strength doesn't come from economic dependency. It comes from adaptability. It comes from building alternatives, so when one door slams shut, five more swing open. And that's exactly what happened. Canada looked beyond the United States, and in doing so, discovered new potential, new power, and new pride. Back in the U.S., the cost of Trump's trade war kept piling up. American consumers paid more for cars, appliances, and housing materials. Tariffs on Canadian lumber alone drove up home construction costs across the Midwest and South. Builders screamed, buyers groaned, but the administration doubled down, insisting the pain was worth it. Except it wasn't, because while Trump claimed these measures would bring jobs roaring back, reality told a different story. Jobs weren't returning, they were disappearing, and industries weren't thriving. They were scrambling to adapt to self-inflicted chaos. This is the brutal irony of economic nationalism without strategy. You promise greatness and deliver confusion. You preach strength and create instability. You wave a flag and watch businesses bolt for friendlier, more predictable partners. That's not sovereignty, that's sabotage. Canada, meanwhile, used every dollar, every reform, every handshake to build something stronger. It didn't reject globalism. It redefined it. It stopped relying on a single partner and instead built bridges to dozens. It protected workers not with slogans, but with investments in the future: clean energy, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, agri-tech. Canada wasn't playing defense anymore. It was investing in its next economic identity. And here's the truth most in Washington refuse to face. Canada didn't just survive Trump's tariffs, it was reborn because of them. This trade war forced Canada to do what it should have done decades ago: reduce its reliance on a volatile U.S. and become a truly global economic player. It's still North American, but no longer North America's backup, and that shift matters because it sends a message to the rest of the world. Economic coercion doesn't work. Countries don't have to cave under pressure. They can adapt. They can diversify. They can build alliances that don't rely on instability from the world's most unpredictable superpower. This is the real legacy of the U.S.-Canada trade war, not the chaos it caused, but the clarity it gave. Clarity about interdependence, clarity about vulnerability, clarity about the true costs of nationalism when it's driven by ego, not strategy. Trump tried to use tariffs as a weapon, but he underestimated his target and overestimated his leverage. Because Canada didn't fold, it forged something new. The lessons are clear. 1. Economic integration runs deeper than any administration's whims. Break that integration, and you don't weaken your rival. You bleed yourself. 2. Resilience isn't just about weathering storms. It's about building structures that don't collapse the moment the wind changes direction. 3. Pride matters. Not the kind you put on a hat, the kind you build into policy, the kind that says, we will not be bullied, we will not be dependent, we will invest, reform, and grow on our own terms. And 4. Real sovereignty is strategic. It's not about isolation. It's about strength through choice, strength through options, strength through knowing that if one partner walks away, you still have a dozen waiting at your door. That's where Canada is now, a country that turned a crisis into a catalyst, a nation that refused to bow and chose instead to evolve. This trade war didn't break Canada, it rebuilt it. And while the U.S. stumbles through the aftermath of its own failed policies, one thing is clear: Canada's not going back. It has new markets, new allies, and a new direction. The next time a president decides to weaponize trade, they'll find a country that's no longer within striking distance because it's moved, it's risen, it's diversified, it's stronger. The truth is, Canada's rise out of the ashes of Trump's trade war wasn't just about economics. It was a statement, a declaration that it would no longer be the junior partner in a lopsided relationship. The days of silent acceptance were over. The message was clear. If Washington wanted to treat allies like enemies, then those allies would find strength elsewhere, and they did. What once looked like a crisis is now seen as a turning point. When Canada stared down the full force of U.S. tariffs on steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, it didn't flinch. It adapted. It rewired its trade networks. It opened up whole new supply chains. And it started investing in domestic production at a scale that hadn't been seen in decades. And the ripple effects? They were seismic. Auto plants in Ontario didn't collapse. They shifted gears. With federal support and a clear mandate, Canada began pouring money into electric vehicle manufacturing, zero-emissions technologies, and the minerals that fuel them. Nickel, lithium, cobalt, Canada's got it, and now it's actually using it. So while the U.S. was stuck in a loop of reactive protectionism, Canada was building the future. And here's where it gets even sharper. The very policies that were meant to corner Canada ended up exposing the vulnerabilities of the U.S. economy itself. The illusion of self-sufficiency cracked wide open when American companies realized they couldn't function without Canadian inputs. When car prices went up, when home construction stalled, when jobs didn't come back, they vanished. That's not economic power. That's economic delusion. And it wasn't just the industries taking the hit. It was everyday people. Families trying to buy homes, now priced out because lumber costs were artificially inflated. Workers in auto manufacturing states suddenly staring at pink slips, not pay raises. Businesses struggling with delays, shortages, and rising costs, all thanks to an incoherent trade policy based on slogans instead of sense. Meanwhile, in Canada, the opposite story was unfolding. Economic nationalism didn't mean building walls. It meant building capacity. It meant understanding that sovereignty isn't about shouting louder. It's about having the ability to choose your own path. That path included deeper ties with Europe, Asia, Mexico, and a growing focus on domestic strength. This wasn't isolation. It was insulation, and it worked. The result? A Canada that's more confident, more connected, and more competitive than it was before Trump ever picked up a tariff pen. The lesson here isn't just about Canada or even North America. It's about what happens when a country refuses to be coerced, when it invests in itself, chooses strategy over reaction, and resilience over dependency. Canada was tested, it passed, and that truth cuts deep. Because while Trump played empire builder with a wrecking ball, Canada was laying bricks, building an economy that wouldn't break under pressure. This wasn't just a rejection of Washington's bullying. It was a masterclass in how to turn external pressure into internal strength. Today, Canada stands taller, not because it shouted louder, but because it planned smarter. It didn't need to retaliate with rage. It responded with results, diversified markets, stronger industries, global respect. So when the next round of threats comes, and they will come, Canada won't blink. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need approval. It has its own plan, its own power, and its own people behind it. If that fires you up as much as it should, like this video, share it far and wide, and subscribe now, because this channel's just getting started and we're not letting up.